Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch, and in this show we discuss topical global issues, and I have conversations with foreign policy thought leaders who discuss their life, career, and the big events that shape their worldview. So as I'm recording this, we are heading into one of the busiest weeks of the year for international diplomacy, and frankly, for me personally. That is the opening of the United Nations General Assembly in New York, in which hundreds of world leaders gather at the United Nations for the big annual show. In the next episode, which I'll probably publish Sunday night, I'll go into some of the high politics and drama and storylines that will drive the agenda during UN Week. But behind this politics and behind this drama are issues of real substance. And arguably the most important substantive issue on the table this week relate to the global refugee crisis. There will be two high-level meetings at the United Nations around refugees and migrants. The first is organized by the United Nations itself and is the so-called, quote, Summit for Refugees and Migrants. The second is being organized by President Obama and is the, quote, Leaders Summit on Refugees. Taken together, these high-level meetings at the UN have the potential to be an important inflection point in the international community's attempt to address the largest global displacement crisis since World War II. On the line to help me put these two summits into broader context of how the world confronts a growing refugee crisis and an ever-increasing number of migrants around the world is Shannon Scribner, a humanitarian policy advisor for Oxfam. Shannon describes what these two distinct summits hope to accomplish, some of their benefits and weak points, and she also does an excellent job of explaining the complex challenge of crafting a global strategy to confront this global problem. This is one of the most important issues of our era, and Shannon does an excellent job of, frankly, putting it all in context. But a couple of quick announcements before we start. The first is that there is a chance that I will host a live taping of Global Dispatches during UN Week in New York City, in which I interview a very high-ranking State Department official. Now, the details are still in flux, and frankly, it's not entirely clear if this is going to happen. It's all kind of coming together at the last minute. But if it does happen, I want you to be the first to know. And I figure the best way to do that is if you sign up for the email list for Global Dispatches. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com and enter your email into the email list field. And if this thing comes together, I will email you with the dates. And I should say that I really look forward to doing this. And even if it doesn't happen, I would love to try to put together another live taping some point in the near future, probably in New York or DC or frankly anywhere that you might invite me to do this. So let me know if that's something that you think you might be interested in attending. The second announcement, and I think you know where I'm going with this, is that we are still in the middle of our fundraising drive. It is September. September is the biggest month, as I said, for me personally. I want to keep delivering to you this podcast at the pace in which I'm delivering it to you. But literally the only way I can do that is if you make a contribution to the podcast. And I'm asking for recurring monthly contributions so I can plan financially and plan the resources that I need to devote, that I'm able to devote to this podcast. So please make a contribution to the podcast. You can do it right now if you're listening to this on your iPhone by clicking on the link in the description page of the podcast episode, or go to globaldispatchespodcast.com and click on the support the show link. I cannot do this without you, and I so appreciate your support. And now here is Shannon Scribner of Oxfam.
The reason that we're even here today in terms of talking about both refugees and migrants is because right now there are 65 million people around the world that have had to leave their home due to violence, persecution, and war. So these people are refugees, but they're also migrants. They're asylum seekers. And some of them have actually been internally displaced within their own country. So and sometimes you can be a migrant and then you can also become a refugee or vice versa. You're a refugee who becomes a migrant. So there's a lot of crossover between a refugee, a migrant, or even an internally displaced person. So both the Secretary General and President Obama decided that they wanted to come together at the UN General Assembly and host two summits, but they're separate summits. And as you were pointing out, the first one, the Secretary General Summit, is focused on refugees and migrants. But President Obama's summit is focused specifically on refugees.
So there's been a lot of talk that we have the world's largest refugee crisis since World War II. It's ongoing, happening right now. I mean, where did it all start? I mean, is it really just because of the numbers of Syrian refugees are so high that they're pushing like the global average up? Where else around the world are the refugees and migrants coming from?
So they're coming from all over the world. Syria seems to be the place where the crisis has really caught attention. But if we look at the Horn of Africa, for example, well, first of all, the average life that someone spends in a refugee camp is 17 years. So if we look at Sudan, if we look at Kenya that hosts the largest refugee camps in the world, they're called Dadaab. People have come from Somalia, from Eritrea. They've come from Ethiopia. We have refugees living in Tanzania. So we have a lot of African displacement, but also African refugees living all over the world. And this has been going on, for decades. The Syria crisis seemed to be the tipping point, though. So we had millions of refugees living for a very long time, either internally inside of a country or they crossed a border into another country for decades. But with Syria, what happened was we have over 4.5 million refugees just from the Syria crisis. And most of those refugees have gone into Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, even Iraq. But when they started crossing the Mediterranean, getting on boats and risking their lives and reaching Europe, that's when it seemed like the world finally paid attention to this refugee crisis that had been ongoing for decades. And that's when we saw images of people risking their lives to make it to Europe. And that seemed to also be the time when President Obama and the Secretary General said, well, we need to do something about this, which is a tragedy because it had been going on for decades.
And so in what ways has the sort of international system in which the UN and other agencies and countries around the world have agreed since World War II to deal with refugees? In what ways has that system sort of held up in the face of this sort of large number of refugees around the world? In what ways has it sort of crippled and failed?
So there is so much normative law that already exists today. So those laws, are everything from the 1951 Refugee Convention and the protocols that followed it. We have conventions on migration. We have international humanitarian law, human rights law. There are so many conventions and protocols that cover what to do when people flee their country, what to do when they become internally displaced or cross a border into another country and become a refugee or someone seeking asylum.
And give an example of one of those.
For example, we have the comprehensive, we have this 1951 Refugee Convention. And the Refugee Convention is really about someone who, when they leave their borders, they have a right to seek asylum. They have a right to look at if they've been persecuted or if they've been tortured or the reason they're leaving that country. And so countries have signed on to these conventions agreeing to protect people seeking asylum or to protect people who have become refugees. So the summits are not about making new international humanitarian law or new conventions, but they are about confirming or reaffirming what's already in these conventions that are not being upheld today in many cases.
So the laws on the books are generally pretty good, but it seems that in the face of this surge in the number of refugees around the world, that countries are not living up to the laws and the treaties which they themselves had signed on to?
Yes. And so two things. So one area where, these conventions, we have guiding principles for people who have become internally displaced. But the Refugee Convention itself does not cover internally displaced people. So that is one area where there is concern, because the majority of the 65 million people are actually internally displaced people.
Like people who just fled to other parts of their country.
Exactly. So they haven't crossed a border. And they're still inside their country, but they have left. They've had to flee their homes because of one reason or another. And the summits won't actually deal and address the situation for displaced people. And that is a concern for us. The other thing that's happening, kind of to your point about not living up to their commitments, is that, we've seen this happen over the years, but especially lately, where, for example, international border management cooperation. States have the authority to control their own borders. So that is we're not at dispute with that. But in these different conventions and protocols, there is supposed to be border security, but also looks at allowing people in or finding a place for these people who are seeking asylum or who are fleeing conflict. And so if you're living in Sudan, or if you're living in Eritrea and you need to flee those countries and you want to go to Europe to do that because you are fleeing persecution, you should be able to they should be able to flee and be protected under these conventions. But what's happening is, for example, the European Union is considering working with the Sudanese and Eritrean governments to actually curb migration. So they want to look at funding detention centers and also other equipment to curb migration. So they're not looking at, okay, what do we do to protect people when they come into our own countries? What do we do to review their asylum cases? They're actually looking at what do we do to stop people from even migrating to Europe in the first place? Because a large majority of refugees that are fleeing to Europe are not actually from Syria, but they're from Africa, Sudan and Eritrea, and other countries in Sudan or in Africa. So that's just one example. Another is that, refugees, there should be a condition that refugees should never have to go home if there is a political solution, if there hasn't been a political solution in the country that they have fled, or that if there's still ongoing conflict.
This is like the principle of non-refoulement, right? The idea that you can't send a refugee back home if it risks putting them back into jeopardy.
Exactly. But what we are seeing is countries like Kenya who are saying, with the Dadaab refugee camps in Kenya, where Somalis have fled because of the conflict in Somalia, but also, we had the famine in 2011 in Somalia, and they fled mostly for reasons because of conflict in their country that continues today in parts of the country. Kenya has said, we're going to close these camps and we're going to send Somalis back home, even though there is an argument to make that the conflict is not resolved, that you're sending people back home to a situation where they can be put in harm's way. So those are just a couple examples.
Well, I guess it seems to me then that the idealistic principles that countries signed on to in the wake of World War II, in the 1951 Refugee Convention and subsequent conventions and protocols, that really, when push comes to shove, when they're faced with a mass number of refugees that they don't want to handle or don't feel that they can handle, then they kind of pick and choose the parts of these conventions that they will abide by.
Yes, and that's why I think we have so far been disappointed with what we're seeing come out of plans for the UN summit in particular. I think we're much more hopeful. Oxfam is much more hopeful with the Obama summit, but not so much the UN summit, because what seems to have happened is that, they've done this document that reaffirms international human rights, refugee laws, and some of the things that we've talked about. The document also condemns, racism, xenophobia, and intolerance around the world today. And it also calls for a more equitable sharing of the burden of responsibility for hosting and supporting world refugees. But then what it does is it seems to evade these commitments. So every promise in this document has a caveat like where appropriate, or every plan says something to the effect of we will consider. So there is a real concern that we have these instruments that countries that sign up to them are supposed to abide by, but it's an ad hoc kind of basis of when they uphold them and when they don't. And the commitments going into the summit don't seem to reaffirm. While they reaffirm the commitments, they seem very wishy-washy, and they seem like it's going to go back to the status quo.
Well, and it's probably worth pointing out that like the summit outcome document is really a reflection of what governments themselves want included in it, right? And so it seems that unless they have some sort of change of attitude, that their caveats and their conditions will be reflected in this outcome document. So a government like Hungary, which has not necessarily lived up to the letter of the law of the Refugee Convention by harassing refugees within its border or not letting refugees cross through its border, will want to insert those kind of caveats into a document so it can sign and say, right, that it's living up to this UN declaration. But in fact, that UN declaration is really a reflection of what the status quo is.
Yes. And so that's absolutely right. There was an original document in April that the Secretary General put out called In Safety and Dignity. And it was supposed to address the large movement of refugees and migrants. And that was supposed to be the basis for this outcome document that's called the New York Declaration on Refugees and Migration. But what has happened is that now we've seen all of these caveats come out of the outcome document, just as you said. And for example, one of the commitments in the safety and dignity document that the Secretary General's report underscored was that there should be a commitment to never detain children. Like, this is something that we should not be doing. We have these conventions and these protocols that say we shouldn't do it. But as one of the caveats, the U.S. government, insisted on including reference to the ability to be able to detain migrant children. And that's because of what's happening along the southern border of the United States. So there's another example of where there is this caveat in the outcome document.
So if not this New York UN summit, then what else can be done? Or is there really like an international solution to this international problem? It doesn't seem like, the global refugee crisis is something that can be dealt with in an ad hoc basis for different regions around the world, that there, because of the facility with which people can move around the world these days, that there really does need to be this global compact. So what prospects are there for a better way forward?
So there is the other summit that it's a President Obama's leadership summit that Oxfam is much more hopeful will actually produce some results. And the reason is because this summit is more of you pay to play for this summit. So this summit is being co-hosted. So it's hosted by the U.S. government. It's on the margins of the UN General Assembly meeting. It's being co-hosted with Canada, Ethiopia, Germany, Jordan, Mexico, Sweden, and the UN Secretary General as well. And it's there's three objectives in this one. The first one is increasing funding to humanitarian appeals and also international organizations. And this has to do with the humanitarian system as being overfunded or underfunded, overwhelmed. Only 1/3 of the appeals are met. And so this target is for a 30% increase.
And it's worth pointing out that the way these appeals work is when there is a disaster in the world, when an earthquake strikes or when a man-made disaster unfolds, a country like, the Central African Republic suddenly descends into civil war, that humanitarian agencies and the United Nations just ask for money to provide for the basic humanitarian relief that's required to kind of keep people alive and help them see them through this crisis. And you're saying that in general, there are most of these appeals are vastly underfunded.
Yes, about 1/3 of the appeals are funded in a given year, these emergency appeals. And then the second point is to admit more refugees, either through resettlement or other legal pathways. And so right now in the United States, this fiscal year, President Obama has resettled, for example, 10,000 Syrian refugees. The global ceiling is usually 100,000 for this fiscal year.
But you say the global ceiling of the number of refugees from around the world that the U.S. will resettle is 100,000.
Yes, thank you. And so this is looking at admitting more refugees globally, asking everyone who attends this particular leadership summit to look at resettling or other legal pathways, which could be reunification of family, it could be a student visa. There's other ways that people can, or humanitarian, they can get a visa for a humanitarian admission as well, and things along those lines.
Can I ask one thing that politically has confused me or caused me a bit of like eyebrow raising is how, okay, on the one hand, yes, the U.S. is the largest global resettler of refugees around the world, that it will take in 100,000 refugees from around the world to its borders. But yet, the most urgent refugee crisis in terms of numbers is the Syrian refugee crisis, and they're only taking in 10,000, where you have a country like Jordan that has like 2 million refugees. How can they credibly look other countries in the eye and tell them to do more when they are only taking in 10,000 Syrian refugees?
Yes. I mean, if you look at Jordan, Turkey, Pakistan, and then Lebanon, even South Africa and the occupied Palestinian territories, they take in, 50% of the world's refugees. And then if you look at the wealthiest countries like US, China, Japan, Germany, France, and the UK, they take less than 9%. So this is the shared responsibility. For the US government and the Syrian crisis in particular, they are dealing with xenophobia. They're dealing with kind of these racist comments about refugees, especially from Syria. So that is why those numbers are lower. It's also proximity to, where do refugees go into certain countries? And it's much more difficult for Syrian refugees to come to the United States. It actually takes about 2 years to be resettled in the U.S. But Oxfam is calling for those numbers to be much higher. And we would actually like that ceiling, the U.S. government ceiling, to go from 100,000 to 200,000 next fiscal year. So we're kind of aiming high at where the U.S. could go, and also to resettle many more Syrians. But it is a question of, standing up at the summit and calling for redoubling the numbers that countries resettle, and then the U.S. having this problem with not only the Syrian refugees that we resettle or find other pathways to bring into this country, but what's happening along our southern borders, as well as we detain children that are coming over to this country from Central America. So yes, they're going to have to stand up and be credible as they're asking other countries to commit to these 3 objectives.
Yet you do say that you are hopeful, though, that these kind of calls for increasing the numbers of refugees to be resettled in wealthier countries will have some sort of will be have some sort of tangible impact.
We are hopeful that the President Obama summit in particular, just because they're going to be firm commitments, where the UN summit is mostly reaffirming with all these caveats. Yeah. So this one looks better. That's the third part of that summit, of the Obama summit, is to increase refugee self-reliance and inclusion through opportunities of education and legal work. And this is really important because one thing that the 1951 Refugee Convention does not say people have the right to work if you become a refugee. And as we've already talked about, the average life in a refugee camp can be 17 years nowadays. So what do we do with children who are growing up in these refugee camps, often with no access to education, or people who cannot legally work and could actually be contributing to society, and also their own self-reliance. So the third point is to increase the number of refugees worldwide that have access to education and to jobs by 1 million. So 1 million more kids in school and 1 million more refugees that have the legal right to work in these countries. And so this one looks more hopeful in terms of, if you have to come to the summit prepared to make these commitments, then the outcomes should be much stronger. But overall, both the UN summit in particular is going to be a 2-year process, where 2 years from now, so in 2018, they're supposed to have this global compact on refugees and an agreement on a global compact for migration as well. So 2 separate compacts are supposed to be put forward and adopted by the UN General Assembly 2 years from now.
So are groups like Oxfam and other sort of refugee advocates hopeful at all that this eventual global compact may be sort of more robust, that perhaps political conditions may change over the next 2 years when this compact is supposed to be finally decided, that there's sort of room for improvement based on what you're describing as a lackluster New York declaration that's coming out this week?
We're hopeful. We were very disappointed by the outcome document. There were consultations in July in New York, Oxfam. It was civil society organizations attended. Oxfam had a delegation that was there, and we were just very disappointed with the outcome document overall. We don't think it outlines a shared responsibility that we've been talking about at all. The fact that it doesn't address IDPs at all or internally displaced people, and that it's evaded these commitments is very, disconcerting. We'll continue to work on this, though, for the next 2 years in hopes that, 2 years from now that we have something that's strong, that has firm commitments. But we're very disappointed with the outcome document so far.
So can I ask, why is this important? Why does there need to be this kind of UN global compact on refugees and migrants? Why do we even need this in the first place?
So, we've talked about, we haven't seen these numbers since World War II in terms of the number of people who have been displaced and living as refugees. And really the projection is that it's going to get much worse and not better. I mean, I remember having a conversation, just within the U.S. government, with congressional offices and even the State Department about the refugee crisis in Syria. And this was 3 years ago. And we had about 2 million refugees at that point that were coming out of that area. And our talking point was it's going to get worse. It's not going to get better. We need to address the conflict, but this is not going in a good direction. And globally, that is the case as well, is that it's not expected that these numbers will decrease, but they're actually going to increase, and that migration is actually going to increase, and people seeking asylum is going to increase because of the number of protracted conflicts we have around the world. So that's why it's crucial to actually understand and commit to how the international community is going to deal with this with national governments, because the problem is going to just increasingly get worse.
And what happens if nothing is done? If we keep kind of going along the same way that we're currently going, with maybe a few marginal fixes, but overall the trajectory is that there will be no dramatic change by the international community to confront this crisis?
I think that then we look at these, unfortunately, what will happen is that these normative laws that we've been putting in place, since, 1951 with the Refugee Convention, the 1967 Protocol on Refugees, and some of these other instruments won't mean anything. And we're starting to see this a little bit with international humanitarian law in terms of protection of health facilities and civilian infrastructure. If you look at, MSF hospitals in Yemen and Afghanistan that have been hit time and again, there is concern that international humanitarian law, which governs, how laws are fought and access and independent access for people, for NGOs and for aid workers, is closing. And so that would be my concern, is that all of these conventions and protocols that we have in place don't mean anything.
So you're saying that when these rules start getting chipped away, like when the prohibition against bombing a hospital gets chipped away, whether by the U.S. government bombing an MSF hospital in Afghanistan or the Saudi government bombing hospitals in Yemen, that overall the protection of these medical facilities keeps getting weaker and weaker. And likewise, if you start violating the rights that were afforded to refugees back in 1951 in the convention, if you start chipping away at that, then more and more of those conventions will be chipped away at, and we'll sort of be left with like an anarchy situation.
I don't know about anarchy, but certainly continued ad hoc responses and caveats for when these conventions and protocols are upheld and when they're not. And if that starts, and that's already started to happen. So if we don't reverse that, I hope it's not anarchy, but the end result will be, more people dying as they're trying to flee their countries, find safe refuge, and not getting that assistance that they were entitled to under these laws.
Well, Shannon, thank you so much for your time. This was helpful.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you all for listening, and glad to take a deep dive into an issue of substance that will be top of the agenda next week. And frankly, as often happens during UN week, the issues of substance are sometimes overshadowed by issues of politics. But nonetheless, I'm glad to learn more about this and to learn kind of behind the scenes what the international community is trying to do to address this terrible, terrible crisis. And again, first, thank you to those of you who have made a contribution to Global Dispatches. I so appreciate it. And there are several of you already who have, and I just thank you from the deepest depths of my heart for your contribution. If you've not already, and if you're considering, please do. Please know that my ability to continue doing this podcast depends on your willingness to contribute to it. I don't think this is content you can really get anywhere else. I love making this podcast week in, week out, but there are other things I could be doing that might frankly be a little more financially beneficial to me. I don't want to have to do those. I want to be able to bring you this podcast week in, week out. But in order to do that, I need your help. So please go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to make a contribution. Or if you're listening to this on your iPhone using the podcast app, click on the link in the description page of this episode. All right. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next time. Bye.